Good evening. The ANC has announced that 10 political parties with seats in the National Assembly have signed the Government of National Unity's Statement of Intent. The parties are the ANC, DA, Patriotic Alliance, IFP, Good, Freedom Front Plus, UDM, Rise Mzansi, PAC and Al-Jama. The ANC says the 10 parties secured over 70% of the vote in the 2024 elections, thus ensuring broad representativity and a strong mandate to govern. In a statement, the party says any further parties wishing to join the GNU will be subject to Clause 24 of the Statement of Intent, which states that there be a discussion and agreement amongst the existing parties whenever new parties want to be part of the GNU. And for some analysis on this, we're now joined by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze, and he joins us now via our video link. Prof, thank you so much for your time. And one would say, looking at that statement from the ANC, at least 10 political parties are now part of the GNU, constituting about 70% of the parties represented in the National Assembly. Would you say that we are now edging closer to seeing that announcement of a cabinet by President Cyril Ramaphosa?
I think there's two different matters. The first one of the joining of the parties and the fact that they said they've now drawn a line from now on. It will be a much more consultative process in order for other parties to join, versus the composition of the executives, both in Gauteng as well as the national one. That is still dependent on quite a lot of negotiations, it appears to be. And the fact that there has been so many postponements, like today in the case of the Gauteng one, for example, is clear that they are not yet at a point where they have reached an agreement on how that will take place. So, in principle, yes, the idea of a government of national unity is certainly now much more clearer of how it's going to look like in terms of the parties. But the role that they are going to play in the government of national unity, that's not yet clear.
And one would say, I mean, looking at how long it's taken for negotiations for this GNU and to get as many parties on board, I mean, some are even asking, why does it seem as if Ramaphosa or the ANC has been taking so long to formalize this government of national unity? What balancing act is he playing at here?
Well, I think initially the idea was that it will be a small coalition consisting of the ANC and the DA and maybe IFP and one or two other parties. But that became not necessarily such an attractive one for both sides, both the ANC and the DA supporters. So then they had to go more into expanding the composition of it in order to be able to counter those criticisms of that the fact that it's included parties that many people don't like to become together. At the same time, the negotiations, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, became very urgent. And what we have seen now is that there is an agreement already in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, but not yet in Gauteng. And there it was because it all was about the NFP. The NFP became the kingmaker, and the ANC had to move as quickly as possible in order to get the NFP in so that they don't go to the MK side. Now that has an implication also on the negotiations, but I think what is now the more of an issue is how to balance the two, broadly speaking, the two sides within the government of national unity. On the one hand, the ANC and the parties that support it, especially in coalitions like Johannesburg, that includes therefore the UDM and Al-Jama and other parties, and then those that were part of the multi-party charter, like the DA, like the IFP, like the Freedom Front Plus and others. So in a sense, was a building of a very broad alliances that exist. And now the tricky question is how to divide very limited spaces in government. That is the members of the cabinet, the deputy ministers, and some positions in parliament. And that's where the real bargaining or horse trading is taking place at the moment.
Would you also say, perhaps, I mean, having so many political parties join the GNU, I mean, the likes of the DA come with at least 87 seats in the National Assembly, and we're now sitting on at least 287 seats when it comes to the GNU. Do you think that perhaps they were trying to safeguard this GNU to ensure that it doesn't collapse? Because that's the conversation that's now taking place when you look at the various demands, being tabled by the likes of the DA.
Well, the reality is that all these small parties don't contribute more than 10% to the total of that 70 that you are talking about, because the ANC and the DA together contribute 62% of that. So it means that the small parties are there in order to broaden the spectrum, but they are not there because of their political strength. They cannot, therefore, if there's some problems between the ANC and the DA, they won't be able to resolve that if they continue, because they, together with the ANC, will maybe just make a 50%. But it will be a very unstable situation. Then it goes into the direction of, for example, the Johannesburg Metro, where one or two parties can pull out, and then there's trouble with the coalition. And the ANC wants to avoid that at all costs. So the only stable arrangement at this point in time, where there is not any question about whether the EFF and MK will be part of it, is an ANC-DA core. They talk about the idea of a sufficient consensus in decision making, and there must be a minimum of 60% for that. And that's exactly what the ANC and the DA will be. The other parties are there in order to demonstrate the inclusiveness of the government of national unity, but they don't have real power in that coalition.
And Professor, as we continue to see, negotiations continue for this cabinet that we are awaiting for President Cyril Ramaphosa to announce. So one would also ask, I mean, when you look at, the likelihood of a collapse because of, some parties not happy with what's being laid on the table, what is the likelihood of us seeing some sort of collapse and for a big collaborator like the DA to even eventually walk away?
I think that chance is very slim. Both the two parties, as I've explained now, the ANC and the DA, I think it's very clear for them how important it is that ultimately they must reach an understanding. And remember, they have already reached an understanding about many things. The principles, the values, what you refer to the statement of intent, it was initially actually a document between the two of them. So that laid the foundation already for many things. What they are now talking about and where the problems are merely, and it's very important, but it is about the sharing of power in the government, in the cabinet. And once they have agreed on that, then that issue will more or less disappear. The issues that will become more pronounced over a longer period will be more policy matters. How they are going to deal with many issues, they've talked about a lekgotla that they will arrange in order to talk more in depth about this. There's talk about a national dialogue that will follow, which will be broader than the government of national unity, I suppose. So these will be longer term and more intensive processes. If we go back to 1994, this what we are seeing now exactly didn't happen also, despite the fact that there was an agreement and the constitution actually determined how this coalition had to be established. But about the division of the seats in cabinet became a huge issue at that stage also. So in a sense, it is predictable that here this matter it's pushed them to a point in terms of seeing who's going to blink first in terms of agreements. But ultimately, I think it is quite predictable that they will come to an agreement. The risks and the damage that it will cause for not doing that is just simply too much.
And Professor, just my last question to you. I mean, when it comes to your anticipation of the cabinet announcement, when do you think the president will most likely make this announcement? I mean, by now on a Sunday, we should have had a cabinet. Traditionally, when you look back in terms of inauguration and how long it takes for us to see that cabinet, when do you think that we are most likely to see that announcement?
Well, I think it's relatively likely this coming week. It cannot be postponed much more. Because remember, at this stage, there's no ministers. There's no, the previous cabinet, the first cabinet of President Ramaphosa does not exist anymore. They've come to an end on the day of his inauguration. So he's the only person in the executive at this point in time. And it's impossible to continue indefinitely like this. So there's lots of pressure on him simply from a constitutional point of view. The Constitution does not provide a deadline for announcing the cabinet. And incidentally, in 2019, after the previous election, President Ramaphosa, and then the situation was very simple. It was only the ANC that was in government. Took another 3 days after his inauguration to announce his cabinet. So it's not absolutely unusual that this is happening like this, and it's very clear because of the negotiations. But I think the pressure on everyone is very much that we must do it. The problem is there is not a deadline, and they will have to create a deadline for themselves to take a final decision.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time this evening. That's Professor Dirk Kotze there, just giving us his insight when it comes to the latest in that GNU statement of intent. We now know at least 10 parties have officially joined the government of national unity.